I authored Resolution 1187. I want that understood before I say another word. Every species in the Galactic Concord knows the number. Most of them cheered when it passed. Some called it the most important piece of legislation in the history of interstellar governance. Others called it the most cowardly. But almost none of them have read the case files that led to it. They know the vote count. They know the result. They do not know what I saw in those files. And they do not know what it cost me to stand before 1,200 species and say out loud what the evidence demanded. I am Thalvek Sorn, retired senior arbiter of the Galactic Concord's War Conduct Bureau, and I banned an entire species from participating in war. By the time I am finished telling you why, you will understand that I did not do it out of hatred, or prejudice, or political ambition. I did it because the alternative was something the galaxy could not survive. The War Conduct Bureau exists because the Galactic Concord decided, roughly 900 years ago, that warfare between species was inevitable, but savagery was optional. Wars happen, territory is contested, resources are finite, old grudges fester into border skirmishes, and border skirmishes escalate into fleet engagements. The Concord does not prevent war, it regulates war. There are rules of engagement, permissible weapons classifications, civilian protection mandates, and escalation thresholds that every member species agrees to follow. My job, for 412 years, was to review conflicts after they concluded, audit the combat footage and battlefield data, identify violations of the established rules, and recommend sanctions against offenders. I reviewed over 9,000 conflicts during my career. Territorial disputes, resource wars, ideological campaigns, punitive expeditions, proxy conflicts, and retaliatory operations. I had seen every kind of violence one species could inflict upon another, cataloged it, analyzed it, filed it, and moved on to the next case. I believed, with the quiet confidence of long experience, that nothing in the galaxy could surprise me anymore. That belief survived exactly until the first human file landed on my desk. It arrived during what should have been a routine quarter. The Vethrani Dominion, a mid-tier military power with respectable ground forces and a fleet large enough to intimidate their regional neighbors, had seized 3 human colony worlds along a contested border region. This kind of territorial aggression happened constantly across the galaxy. A stronger power identifies weaker neighbors, calculates that the cost of conquest is lower than the cost of negotiation, and sends in the troops. The Vethrani committed 40,000 soldiers, orbital bombardment platforms, and 4 armored divisions to the operation. Standard overwhelming force for a territorial grab of that size, they expected minimal resistance and a quick surrender. The humans had a colonial militia spread across the 3 worlds, roughly 6,000 personnel total. No orbital fleet within response range. Their weapons were a generation behind the Vethrani standard in both power output and targeting capability. By every model the Bureau used to predict conflict outcomes, this engagement should have lasted between 3 and 5 standard days, ending with a human surrender and a negotiated withdrawal under Concord-mediated terms. I opened the file expecting to process exactly that kind of routine outcome. The conflict lasted 11 days. The humans won. I read that line in the summary report 3 times before I opened the combat footage. I remember the stillness in my office as I loaded the first file, the faint hum of the environmental systems, the way the light from my display caught the edge of my water glass. Those small details fixed themselves in my memory because everything I thought I understood about warfare changed after I pressed play. The humans did not defend their cities. Every tactical doctrine I had ever studied, across every species I had ever reviewed, placed highest priority on the defense of urban centers. Cities contain critical infrastructure, population concentrations, administrative capacity, and economic resources. You defend cities because cities are what wars are fought over. The humans abandoned them. They pulled their militia out of every major settlement within hours of the Vethrani landing and disappeared into the surrounding terrain as if the buildings and streets and power stations meant nothing to them. The Vethrani took the cities without firing a single shot and declared the operation essentially complete. They transmitted initial victory reports to their command authority. They began establishing occupation governments and processing the few civilians who had remained behind. Everything appeared to be following the expected pattern of a successful territorial seizure. Then the dying started. The human militia had not retreated. They had repositioned. They had pulled back into mountain ranges, dense forests, underground tunnel networks, and coastal marshlands that the Vethrani had dismissed as strategically irrelevant. They had pre-positioned supplies, weapons caches, and communication equipment in locations the Vethrani scanners could not detect. And from these positions, they launched a sustained campaign of coordinated attacks that turned the occupation into a catastrophe. They struck at night, in severe weather, during shift rotations, during resupply convoys, during moments of maximum vulnerability. They collapsed bridges onto advancing armored columns, using demolition charges placed days before the invasion began. They contaminated water purification stations with compounds that were harmless to humans, but violently incompatible with Vethrani biology. They turned mining equipment into improvised explosive devices and agricultural surveillance drones into targeting platforms. A Vethrani armored convoy moving through a mountain pass was buried under a landslide that 3 separate engineering analyses later confirmed was deliberately triggered using commercial excavation charges positioned weeks before any Vethrani soldier set foot on the planet. The humans had prepared for this. Not the specific invasion by the specific Vethrani force at the specific time it occurred. They had prepared for the concept of invasion itself. They had looked at their colony worlds, assessed every terrain feature and infrastructure vulnerability, and built contingency plans for exactly the kind of scenario that was now unfolding. They had assumed, as a routine matter of colonial planning, that someone might eventually come to take what was theirs. And they had quietly, methodically, almost casually decided what they would do about it. I watched 40 hours of combat footage over 2 days. I stopped eating properly. I stopped sleeping at my normal intervals. I watched human militia fighters engage Vethrani soldiers in conditions that should have made organized combat impossible. Driving rain so heavy that electronic sensor equipment failed completely. Darkness so absolute that the Vethrani troops could not see the ground beneath their feet. Terrain so broken and unstable that armored vehicles bogged down and had to be abandoned. The humans fought in all of it. They fought as if the terrible conditions were not obstacles to overcome, but advantages to exploit. As if the storms and darkness and broken ground were weapons in their arsenal, rather than hazards to endure. One piece of footage stayed with me longer than all the rest. A single human soldier, a woman named Lucy Harrow, according to the after-action report, was cut off from her unit during a Vethrani countersweep operation on the second colony world. She found herself alone behind enemy lines, separated from all support, in territory controlled by thousands of Vethrani soldiers, actively hunting for militia fighters. She had a standard-issue rifle with limited ammunition, a sidearm, a combat knife, and whatever she could scavenge from the terrain and from the enemy dead. She survived behind those lines for 6 days. In those 6 days, she killed 31 Vethrani soldiers. She moved through their patrol zones like a predator through tall grass, striking without warning and vanishing before response teams could converge on her position. She left bodies for the next patrol to find, each one a message that something was hunting them in their own secured territory. On the 4th day, she ambushed a Vethrani armored transport at a river crossing, killed the entire 4-member crew with her sidearm and knife, and then spent 3 hours teaching herself to operate the alien vehicle by studying the control markings and testing inputs until she understood the interface. She drove the stolen transport into a Vethrani field command post at full speed, detonated the vehicle's onboard fuel cells on impact, and walked out of the resulting fire carrying a data core filled with encrypted Drakari communication codes that human intelligence teams would later use to devastating effect. She had a broken arm. She had 3 penetrating wounds, deep enough that the field medics could see bone through the torn tissue. The medical report from the field station, where she was eventually treated, noted that she asked for exactly 2 things upon arrival: water and the current grid position of her unit. She did not ask for pain medication. She did not ask to be evacuated to a rear area hospital. She did not ask for rest. She drank the water, accepted the emergency splint on her broken arm, and submitted a formal request to return to active combat duty. I sat in my office, staring at that medical report for a very long time. I had reviewed 9,000 conflicts, spanning hundreds of species and centuries of warfare. I had documented acts of remarkable bravery, extraordinary determination, and fierce resilience from dozens of different civilizations. But I had never encountered anything like Lucy Harrow, and what disturbed me most deeply was not the specific acts she had performed, impressive and harrowing as they were. What disturbed me was the tone of the medical report itself. The medics who treated her did not describe her behavior as extraordinary, they did not flag it as exceptional or worthy of special commendation beyond the standard notation. They recorded it the way they would record any competent soldier performing her duties under difficult field conditions. As if this was simply what humans did when things went wrong. As if Lucy Harrow was not remarkable, but representative. I expanded my review. I pulled every available piece of data from the entire 11-day conflict across all 3 worlds. Combat footage, after-action reports, medical files, communication intercepts, supply logs, casualty figures, and Vethrani intelligence assessments. I found Lucy Harrow's story repeated, in different forms and at different scales, everywhere I looked. Humans fighting with severe wounds that should have rendered them incapable of standing, let alone engaging in combat. Humans fighting without ammunition, using rocks, metal bars, sharpened tools, and their bare hands against armored opponents. Humans improvising weapons from civilian technology with a creativity that defied every prediction model. Humans refusing to surrender when surrounded, outnumbered, outgunned, and bleeding. Not because they were irrational. I reviewed their internal communications carefully. They were calm. They coordinated efficiently. They made tactical decisions with clear logic and precise execution. They simply did not include surrender among the available options. It was not on their list. It was not in their vocabulary. It did not exist for them as a concept that applied to their situation. The Vethrani withdrew after 11 days. They had committed 40,000 troops and lost over 12,000 of them. Their commanding general submitted a formal protest to the Concord, alleging that the humans had violated the rules of engagement through unauthorized environmental warfare tactics and the weaponization of civilian infrastructure. I reviewed his complaint with the thoroughness my position demanded. Every single tactic the humans had employed fell within the established legal framework. Barely, in several cases, with margins thin enough to generate legitimate debate, but within it. The Vethrani general was not really protesting a legal violation. He was protesting the fact that he had lost a war he should have won, by every established military metric, and he wanted someone to explain to him how that was possible. I could have explained it to him. I was beginning to understand. The humans did not fight the way other species fight. Other species wage war as an extension of policy, as a calculated tool employed to achieve specific objectives at an acceptable cost. They fight until the cost exceeds the benefit, and then they negotiate. War, for every species in my files, was a tool with an off switch. You use it when the math supports it, and you stop when the math turns against you. The humans did not have that switch. They treated war not as a policy instrument, but as something deeply personal, something that engaged a part of their psychology that no cost-benefit analysis could reach or influence. They did not fight to achieve strategic objectives. They fought because someone had come to their worlds and threatened their people, and something inside them, something ancient and deep and absolutely uncompromising, refused to allow them to stop fighting for any reason short of victory or death. I wrote a memo to the Concord Security Council. It was 3 pages long and carefully worded, built on data rather than speculation. I outlined the statistical anomalies in the Vethrani-human conflict, flagged the behavioral patterns that deviated sharply from every known species model, and recommended that a deeper analysis be conducted into human military psychology and capability. I titled it Preliminary Behavioral Anomalies, Human Military Conduct. I sent it through proper channels with the appropriate priority classification and waited for a response. Nobody read it. I received an automated acknowledgement from the Council's administrative office. 2 junior analysts were assigned to review my memo at their earliest convenience. Their earliest convenience turned out to be never. The memo was filed, categorized, and forgotten in the administrative machinery of galactic governance. The Vethrani-human conflict was classified as a minor border dispute with an anomalous outcome, unusual but not significant enough to warrant senior council attention. I went back to my regular caseload. I reviewed other conflicts, filed other reports, and performed my duties with the same diligence I had maintained for 4 centuries. But in the quiet hours, when my office was empty and the displays were dark, I kept returning in my mind to Lucy Harrow. Water and her unit's position, those were the only 2 things she needed, as if the broken bones and the bleeding wounds and the 6 days alone in enemy territory were simply conditions to be managed, not experiences to recover from. I did not know, sitting there in the silence of my office, that the second human file was already being generated 300 light-years away. And I could not have known that the second file would make the first one look like nothing more than a gentle introduction to something far larger and far more terrifying. The Kelvari Confederation declared war on humanity 2 years and 4 months after the Vethrani border skirmish. The Kelvari were not the Vethrani. The Vethrani were a mid-tier regional power that had overextended against an opponent they had catastrophically underestimated. The Kelvari were a genuine military force, consistently ranked among the 12 strongest naval powers in the Concord, with a professional military numbering in the tens of millions and a fleet that had never lost a major engagement in over 2 centuries of active warfare. When the Kelvari went to war, they did not gamble or improvise. They calculated with precision, they prepared with thoroughness, and they overwhelmed with numerical and technological superiority that left no room for lucky outcomes. The stated cause was a disputed mineral extraction corridor along the Kelvari human frontier, but I had been analyzing conflicts long enough to recognize predatory expansion dressed in diplomatic language. The Kelvari had watched the Vethrani embarrassment from a comfortable distance and drawn exactly the wrong conclusion. They believed the Vethrani had failed because the Vethrani were incompetent, not because the humans were extraordinary. The Kelvari were not incompetent. They would commit force sufficient to make the outcome inevitable, and they would execute their campaign with the professional discipline that had made them one of the most feared military powers in the galaxy. They invaded 12 human star systems simultaneously. They deployed 1.2 million ground troops supported by heavy armor and atmospheric superiority fighters. Their naval armada outnumbered the human frontier fleet by a factor of 8 in total tonnage and by a factor of 12 in capital-class warships. They brought orbital bombardment platforms capable of reducing cities to molten glass from the safety of high orbit. The operation was designed to be so overwhelming that resistance would be not just futile, but absurd. The Bureau assigned me to monitor the conflict in real time, an unusual designation reserved for wars with potential to escalate beyond regional significance. Someone on the council had apparently found my earlier memo buried in the administrative archives and decided that perhaps it deserved attention after all. The first phase of the war unfolded exactly as the Kelvari had planned. The human frontier fleet engaged the Kelvari armada in the outer systems and fought with the same ferocity I had observed in the Vethrani conflict. They inflicted losses that exceeded Kelvari planning projections by a factor of 4, destroying or crippling dozens of Kelvari warships in a series of desperate engagements that turned contested space into graveyards of burning metal. But they were outgunned and overwhelmingly outnumbered, and courage cannot indefinitely compensate for mathematics. The human frontier fleet was functionally destroyed in 3 major battles over 9 days. 4 colony worlds fell under Kelvari occupation within the first 2 weeks. 2 million human civilians found themselves living under Kelvari military governance, their streets patrolled by soldiers who had come to take their worlds and expected gratitude for the restraint they showed in doing so. The Kelvari Supreme Commander, a career strategist named Torith Val who had personally overseen 6 successful military campaigns, transmitted the standard terms of surrender on the 15th day. The terms were, by galactic standards, remarkably generous. Territorial concession of the disputed corridor, partial demilitarization of the human frontier, economic reparations scaled to human capacity, and a mutual non-aggression pact with Concord arbitration. Every species in my database, every single one, had accepted similar or harsher terms when faced with the loss of multiple worlds and the destruction of their primary defensive fleet. The strategic calculus was unambiguous. The frontier was gone. The fleet was gone. Further resistance would only increase casualties and worsen the eventual terms. Surrender was the rational option by every measure that rational beings use to evaluate such situations. The humans did not respond to the surrender terms. Not with a formal rejection. Not with a counterproposal. Not with defiant rhetoric or diplomatic maneuvering. They did not respond at all. Complete, total, unbroken silence, as if the transmission had vanished into empty space without reaching anyone. I was monitoring Torith Val's command ship when his communication officers reported the silence. I watched the confusion register in his posture, the slight stiffening of his upper body, the unconscious tilt of his head that among Kelvari indicated cognitive dissonance. He ordered the surrender terms retransmitted with a 48-hour acceptance deadline and a clear statement of the consequences of continued resistance. The deadline expired without acknowledgement. The silence continued. On the 18th day of the war, my monitoring station began receiving intelligence reports that made no conventional tactical sense. Human factory worlds deep in their core territory, hundreds of light years from the front lines, were converting to wartime production. Not gradually, through the orderly bureaucratic channels of military procurement and industrial planning. They were converting overnight. Entire planetary economies were pivoting from civilian manufacturing to weapons production, ship construction, and military supply fabrication in a matter of days. I ran the conversion rates through our industrial capacity models, and the models returned results flagged as computational errors. No centralized governmental authority could reorganize an industrial base that rapidly, not with the most efficient command economy imaginable. Then I examined the data more carefully and realized it was not centralized at all. Individual factory managers, corporate boards, industrial cooperative councils, and even small workshop owners were making the conversion decision independently, without waiting for government directives. They were choosing to retool for war production on their own initiative, because they understood what was happening to their species, and they had already decided, without being told, what they were going to do about it. The volunteer enrollment figures destroyed my demographic models entirely. The Human Military Command issued a general mobilization call on the 20th day of the war. Within 72 hours, they had received more volunteer applications than their processing infrastructure could physically handle. Recruitment stations were overwhelmed. Data systems crashed under the volume. And these were not conscripts compelled by law to serve. These were volunteers, individual humans who walked into enlistment offices of their own free will, without coercion or legal obligation, and asked to be sent to the front. My analysts ran the enrollment rates through our standard species demographic models, which calculated expected voluntary military participation based on aggregate data from every civilization in the Concord's records. The models predicted a maximum voluntary enlistment rate for a species of humanity's size and development level. The humans exceeded that maximum within the first 6 hours of mobilization. By the end of the first week, they had exceeded it by a factor of 11. My senior analyst submitted the figures to me with a note that simply said, "These numbers cannot be correct, but they are." Reports from the occupied worlds began arriving that disturbed me in an entirely different way. The Kelvari occupation forces were encountering organized armed resistance from the human civilian population, not from remnant military units or trained militia. From civilians, elderly humans who had never held a weapon in their lives were picking up whatever they could find and fighting back. Teenagers were constructing explosive devices in basements, using chemical compounds scavenged from household supplies. Medical workers were treating wounded resistance fighters in hidden clinics during the day and conducting sabotage operations against Kelvari infrastructure at night. A retired schoolteacher named Daniel Cross, 67 years old, who had spent his career teaching literature to young people, organized a resistance cell on the second occupied world that destroyed 14 Kelvari supply depots in a single coordinated night operation, using explosive compounds synthesized from agricultural fertilizer. He had never touched a weapon before the day the Kelvari landed on his world. Within 3 weeks of the occupation, he was commanding a network of 200 civilian fighters who had turned an entire province into a zone that Kelvari patrols entered at mortal risk. The Kelvari responded to the growing resistance with increased military presence, more aggressive patrol schedules, and harsher security measures including collective punishments and movement restrictions. These measures made the resistance exponentially worse. Every act of Kelvari repression generated more fighters. Every crackdown produced more saboteurs. Every punitive measure hardened the civilian population's resolve rather than breaking it. The humans did not respond to pressure the way the Calvari models predicted. They did not calculate the personal risk and decide that compliance was safer than resistance. They looked at the soldiers patrolling their streets and occupying their homes, and something inside them caught fire, and that fire did not diminish under pressure. It grew. By the second month, the humans had rebuilt their fleet, not patched together a handful of surviving ships. Rebuilt it from scratch. They had constructed new warships at a production rate that the Bureau's industrial analysts formally classified as logistically impossible in their official assessment, before grudgingly acknowledging that the impossible was nevertheless happening. They had crewed these ships with personnel who were, in disturbingly many cases, civilians who had completed accelerated naval training programs lasting weeks rather than the standard years of professional military education. These should have been ineffective crews, flying hastily assembled ships, held together with emergency welds and good intentions. They were not. The humans did not merely produce quantity to replace their losses. They produced innovation to surpass what they had lost. A technical intelligence report crossed my desk on the 43rd day of the war that I read 4 times before I was willing to believe it. A human research team, working out of a university that had been a civilian medical school 6 weeks earlier, had developed a method to remotely destabilize the magnetic containment systems on Calvari shipboard fusion reactors. They had recovered wreckage from Calvari warships destroyed in the frontier battles, reverse-engineered the reactor containment field geometry from the debris, identified a harmonic resonance vulnerability in the field architecture, and designed a modified sensor pulse that could trigger a cascading containment failure from a standoff distance of several thousand kilometers. They had conceived the theoretical concept, proven it in laboratory conditions, engineered a practical emitter array, tested it against captured Calvari reactor components, mass-produced the emitter systems in converted civilian factories, and integrated them into the rebuilt fleet's weapons platforms. The entire developmental arc, from first theoretical insight to deployed operational weapon, had taken 4 months. 4 months. I had reviewed weapons development timelines for over 300 species across my career. The fastest comparable development cycle I had ever documented was 6 years, achieved by the Solari during a period of intensive military competition, and that timeline had been considered a remarkable achievement worthy of detailed study. The humans accomplished the same feat in 4 months, while fighting a war, while simultaneously rebuilding their entire fleet from near-total destruction, while training thousands of new naval personnel, while sustaining a sprawling civilian resistance movement on 4 occupied worlds. They did all of it at once, and the weapon they produced was not a crude improvisation, but an elegant exploitation of a fundamental vulnerability that the Calvari's own engineers had never identified in their own technology. The Calvari discovered the weapon's existence in the most direct way possible. A human battle group engaged a Calvari defensive formation in the Sarath system and activated the resonance emitters. 11 Calvari warships simultaneously suffered cascading magnetic containment failures. The ships did not explode, they died. Their reactors simply stopped functioning, the containment fields collapsing in waves that left the fusion cores inert and cold. The vessels went dark, drifting without power or propulsion, and human boarding teams captured them intact with their crews still alive and unharmed inside the powerless hulls. The Calvari fleet commander in the sector ordered an immediate retreat and transmitted an urgent request to Torith Val for strategic reassessment and massive reinforcement. I pulled the communication intercepts from that chaotic retreat, and buried in the flood of tactical data I found a single transmission that became, for me, the defining artifact of the entire war. A human fleet admiral named Kate Morrison was commanding a task force that had been ordered to intercept a Calvari battle group in the Brevin corridor. The Calvari formation was 3 times her size in total combat tonnage. Her tactical officers ran the engagement projections and advised withdrawal. The numbers were unambiguous. Engagement against a force of that size with her available assets meant unacceptable losses. The mathematical models recommended regrouping with reinforcements and engaging on more favorable terms. Kate Morrison's response was recorded in the ship's command log. She referenced a Calvari orbital bombardment of a human settlement called Harvest Landing, carried out 3 weeks earlier, that had killed 12,000 civilians. She said 6 sentences that I have never forgotten. They burned Harvest Landing. 12,000 civilians. 4,100 of them were children. We are not regrouping. We are going through them. All units, attack speed. She lost a third of her fleet in the engagement that followed. She destroyed the entire Kelvari battle group. Every warship, every support vessel, every orbital weapons platform. When the firing stopped and the debris fields cooled, she gathered her surviving ships, transmitted casualty reports and ammunition status to Fleet Command, and set course for the next Kelvari defensive position without pausing. I ran Kate Morrison's decision through every known species military doctrine in the Bureau's comprehensive database. I modeled it against Vethrani tactical protocols, Kelvari strategic frameworks, Solari fleet engagement parameters, Rathani naval doctrine, and 37 other military traditions representing the full spectrum of galactic warfare. Not one of them would have engaged, not a single one. The tactical situation was unfavorable by every quantitative measure. The risk of catastrophic loss was near certain. The potential strategic gain did not justify the guaranteed casualties. Every rational military decision-making framework in the galaxy produced the same output: withdraw, preserve combat power, seek more favorable engagement conditions. Kate Morrison did not withdraw, and the reason she did not withdraw had nothing to do with tactics, strategy, fleet logistics, or military mathematics. She did not withdraw because 12,000 people were dead, and 4,100 of them were children, and something in her psychology, something that operated below the level of strategic calculation, would not permit her to turn away from the force responsible for those deaths. She went through them because going through them was the only response that the deepest architecture of her mind would accept as adequate. The Kelvari Confederation surrendered unconditionally after 9 months of warfare. They had entered the war with 12 times the humans' naval tonnage and absolute technological superiority across every weapons category. They lost 60% of their fleet. Their economy was severely damaged. Their occupied worlds had been liberated through coordinated fleet operations and civilian resistance. Their supreme commander, Torith Val, transmitted his unconditional surrender from a command vessel that was the last fully operational warship in what had once been one of the most powerful armadas in galactic history. The terms the humans imposed were stern, but measured. Complete territorial restoration, substantial but payable war reparations, military limitation treaties with verification protocols, and a permanent monitoring presence in Kelvari border space. The humans did not seek to destroy the Kelvari Confederation. They did not demand humiliating concessions or punitive dismemberment. They sought to ensure, with thorough and uncompromising precision, that the Kelvari would never do this again. It was controlled. It was proportional. It was calibrated to achieve a specific strategic objective, and it did not exceed that objective by a single provision. And that, I realized with growing certainty, was perhaps the most frightening characteristic of all. The humans were not berserkers who fought in mindless fury until exhaustion stopped them. They were not revenge-driven primitives, lashing out without discrimination. They chose their level of response with deliberate, conscious precision. They decided what was proportional and what was excessive, and they held to that distinction even in the aftermath of atrocities that would have driven most species to unconstrained retaliation. Their fury had structure. Their anger had discipline, and that combination was more terrifying than any amount of mindless rage could ever be. I sent my second memo to the Security Council. It was 12 pages of detailed analysis. I included statistical comparisons, behavioral modeling data, industrial production charts, weapons development timelines, and a comprehensive chronological reconstruction of human military adaptation throughout the 9-month conflict. I titled it, The Escalation Problem. Humans do not recognize unwinnable conditions. I flagged it with the highest priority classification available to my office and sent it to every member of the council personally. 3 council members read it this time. One of them, a senior diplomat from the Rathani Assembly, sent me a private communication in response. The message was brief and dismissive. It said, "You are overstating the threat. They are a young species. They will mature. All species eventually learn to wage war rationally." I stared at that message for a very long time. I thought about Lucy Harrow and her broken arm and her 2 requests. I thought about Daniel Cross and his fertilizer explosives, and his network of civilian fighters. I thought about Kate Morrison and the burning wreckage of Harvest Landing, and her 6 sentences that ended with attack speed. I thought about the researchers who invented a new weapon in 4 months, and the factory workers who rebuilt a fleet in 6 weeks, and the volunteers who overwhelmed recruitment systems in numbers that broke every predictive model we possessed. I deleted the diplomat's message. I went home. I did not sleep. In the morning, I returned to my office and began systematically pulling every piece of data the Bureau had ever collected on human military history, human psychology, human social organization, and human industrial capability. I was building something. I did not yet know exactly what it would look like when it was finished, but I knew with absolute certainty that it was necessary. The third file was already being compiled in a star system 300 light-years from my office, and the third file would be the one that broke everything wide open. The Drakari Imperium was a rising power with ambitions that exceeded its capabilities by a considerable margin, and leadership that had confused cruelty with strategic strength. They had watched both the Vethrani embarrassment and the Kelvari catastrophe from the sidelines, and they had drawn their own conclusions about what those conflicts meant and how to avoid repeating the mistakes of others. The Vethrani had been too weak. The Kelvari had been too conventional. Both had fought the humans on military terms and discovered that military terms favored the humans. The Drakari believed they had identified a different approach. They would not attempt to defeat humanity through superior force or conventional military operations. They would break the human spirit first, through an act of violence so shocking, so disproportionate, and so deliberately cruel that the humans would understand the futility of resistance before any real war began. Terror as strategy, atrocity as diplomacy. I learned later that the Drakari Military Command spent 4 months debating and refining this strategy before they acted on it. Their intelligence division produced a detailed psychological profile of humanity that analyzed human responses to previous conflicts, modeled their emotional processing patterns, and concluded, with the confident precision that intelligence analysts bring to catastrophically wrong assessments, that humans could be intimidated into submission through a sufficiently shocking act of violence directed against a purely civilian target. I have since read that profile in its entirety. It is, without question, the most fundamentally mistaken document in the history of galactic intelligence analysis. The target they selected was a human station called Meridian Point, a combined medical research facility and civilian residential hub orbiting the 4th planet in the Aldara system. Meridian Point was not a military installation by any definition. It had no weapons systems, no defensive capabilities, and no military garrison. It housed 4,000 medical and scientific researchers, 2,000 operational support staff, 800 advanced medical students completing their clinical rotations, and 1,600 family dependents who lived aboard the station with their researcher spouses and parents. Among those dependents were 600 children. The station's pediatric care center served not only the resident families, but provided specialist treatment for children from surrounding colony worlds across the sector. The Drakari strike force arrived in the Aldara system without prior warning, disabled Meridian Point's communication array with a precision electromagnetic pulse, and opened fire on the undefended station with heavy naval weapons designed to engage armored warships. The attack lasted 47 minutes. When the Drakari ships withdrew, Meridian Point was a shattered ruin, tumbling slowly through orbit, its hull breached in over 100 locations, its atmosphere venting into space, its interior exposed to vacuum. 8,400 humans were dead. Among the dead were the entire staff and patient population of the pediatric care center. The youngest victim was 4 months old. The Drakari broadcast footage of the destroyed station across every open communication channel in the sector. They accompanied the footage with a formal declaration from the Drakari Imperator, stating that this attack was a demonstration of Drakari power and resolve, and that any species or polity that interfered with Drakari expansion would face identical consequences. The strategic theory was not without historical precedent. Terror strikes against civilian targets had been employed by dozens of species throughout galactic history as a means of compelling adversaries to negotiate from a position of fear rather than strength. The targeted species invariably responded with public outrage, followed by urgent diplomatic communication, followed by concessions designed to prevent further attacks. It was a brutal tactic, but within the range of methods that the galaxy's violent history had demonstrated to be effective. The humans did not respond. Not with public outrage, not with diplomatic demands, not with threats of retaliation, not with emergency petitions to the Concord for intervention, not with anything at all. The communication channels that should have been overwhelmed with human fury and grief and calls for action were silent, completely, absolutely, and profoundly silent. The silence was not the silence of a broken communication system. It was the silence of a species that had received a message and chosen not to answer it. One day passed, then 2, then 5, then a full week. The Drakari leadership, which had been anticipating a specific sequence of human reactions and had prepared detailed response plans for each stage of that anticipated sequence, found itself confronting a situation for which no plan existed. They had expected rage. They had built their entire strategy around the predictable arc of rage, shock, then fury, then fear, then negotiation. Silence was not on their strategic map. Silence could not be exploited, manipulated, or responded to. Silence was an absence where there should have been signal, and the Drakari did not know what it meant. Other species began reaching out to the human government, offering condolences, requesting official statements, asking with increasing anxiety what humanity intended to do. The human government responded to every inquiry, from every ambassador and diplomat and head of state, with the same 7 words: "We are aware of the Drakari action." Nothing more. No elaboration, no timeline, no expression of emotion, no indication of intent. 7 words, repeated in identical phrasing regardless of who was asking or how many times they asked. It was the most unsettling diplomatic communication I had ever encountered, and I had been reading diplomatic communications for 4 centuries. I monitored every channel available to the Bureau during those weeks of silence. I deployed every intelligence asset, every surveillance capability, every analytical resource at my disposal to penetrate the wall of silence and determine what was happening behind it. I found almost nothing. The human diplomatic corps continued to operate normally. Human trade ships continued their scheduled routes. Human citizens went about their daily routines. From the outside, to any observer who looked only at the surface, it appeared as though humanity had absorbed the worst terrorist atrocity in its history and simply continued functioning as if nothing significant had occurred. I knew better. I had spent more than 2 years studying human military behavior with an intensity that bordered on obsession. I had built psychological models, behavioral frameworks, and predictive algorithms specifically designed to anticipate human responses to various forms of provocation. And every one of those models, every framework and algorithm, was telling me the same thing. The silence was not shock, it was not paralysis, it was not indifference, it was preparation. On the 14th day of the silence, sitting alone in my office at 3 in the morning, I felt something I had never experienced in 4 centuries of professional service. I felt dread, not concern. Not the measured unease of a professional identifying a developing situation. Dread, the deep, instinctive, nearly physical recognition that something terrible was approaching, with the certainty of orbital mechanics, and it could not be stopped or diverted. I sent an urgent advisory to the full Security Council on day 15. I told them, in language as direct as I could make it, that the human silence was not a sign of weakness, capitulation, or psychological collapse. I told them that based on my extensive analysis of human behavioral patterns across multiple conflicts, the silence almost certainly meant that humanity was engaged in large-scale preparations for a response of unprecedented scope and precision. I told them that the Drakari had made a catastrophic strategic miscalculation, and that the consequences, when they materialized, would be unlike anything the Concord had previously witnessed. The Council acknowledged receipt of my advisory. They took no action. 47 days after the destruction of Meridian Point, the silence ended. The humans did not declare war. I want to be absolutely precise about this, because the distinction matters enormously. In the entire course of what followed, no formal declaration of hostilities was ever issued by any human governmental body. No ultimatum was delivered through diplomatic channels. No demands were transmitted. No deadline was set. On the 48th day after the attack on Meridian Point, every Drakari military installation, naval shipyard, orbital defense platform, strategic command center, tactical communication hub, intelligence processing facility, weapons manufacturing plant, and military supply depot across the entire territory of the Drakari Imperium was struck simultaneously. Every single one, without exception, across an empire spanning dozens of star systems. I was in the Bureau's primary monitoring center when the reports began flooding in. My staff and I stood at our stations and watched in real time as the scope and precision of the attack became clear with each successive data feed. The humans had not targeted a sector, or a front, or a strategic concentration of enemy assets. They had targeted everything. Every military installation the Drakari possessed, including facilities that the Drakari's own allies and intelligence partners had not known existed, was hit at the same moment with weapons deployed from delivery platforms that no intelligence service in the galaxy had detected or catalogued. The strike platforms were stealth systems of a type that no species in the Concord had previously observed. Our best technical analysts later estimated that they had been positioned over a period of approximately 30 to 45 days, moved into place gradually during the weeks of silence, using propulsion and sensor evasion technologies that the humans had apparently developed and deployed, without any detectable testing or procurement trail. The humans had spent their silence doing exactly what I had feared, mapping every military asset the Drakari possessed with intelligence-gathering capabilities that exceeded anything the Bureau's own substantial resources could have achieved, and positioning precision strike platforms within range of all of them simultaneously. In a coordinated operation lasting less than 90 seconds, the Drakari military ceased to exist as a functional entity, not degraded, not diminished, not forced into retreat. Ceased to exist. Every command node was destroyed. Every shipyard was reduced to cooling slag. Every warship in dock was wreckage. The few Drakari vessels that happened to be in transit or on distant patrol at the moment of the strike suddenly found themselves alone, cut off from all communication and command authority, without resupply capability, without repair facilities, without orders, adrift in a galaxy that had just watched their civilization's entire military infrastructure evaporate in the time it takes to draw a single breath. Human ground forces began landing on the Drakari homeworld and every major Drakari colony within hours of the orbital strikes. I monitored the ground campaign with every resource at my disposal, and what I observed confirmed my deepest fears in the most precise, methodical, and clinical way imaginable. The humans did not occupy, they did not conquer, they did not impose military governance or establish occupation zones. They dismantled the Drakari military machine, piece by piece, facility by facility, system by system, with the methodical thoroughness of engineers disassembling a malfunctioning machine for detailed inspection. Weapons factories were identified, entered by human engineering teams, and systematically stripped of every piece of military-grade manufacturing equipment. Research laboratories were cataloged, their personnel secured, their databases copied for intelligence analysis, and then wiped clean. Training facilities were emptied, their equipment removed, their infrastructure repurposed. Communication arrays were dismantled with such extraordinary precision that the civilian communication infrastructure sharing the same physical networks remained completely functional, while every military channel went permanently dark. The civilian casualty figures from the entire ground campaign, conducted across multiple worlds against a hostile population of billions, were nearly zero. Nearly zero. This was not an accident. This was not luck or favorable circumstances. This was the product of operational planning so thorough, intelligence so comprehensive, and tactical execution so disciplined that it represented something I did not have an adequate word for in my language, or any other language I spoke. I watched hours of ground operation footage, human soldiers clearing Drakari military compounds with weapons ready and trigger discipline so exacting that not a single round was discharged without confirmed military target identification. Human engineering teams disassembling alien weapons systems they had never physically encountered before, working from technical specifications extracted from Drakari intelligence databases that had been penetrated and copied during the 47 days of silence. A human sergeant at a civilian checkpoint, speaking through a translation device with calm and patient authority, assuring a terrified Drekari family that they would not be harmed, that no civilians would be targeted, that they should proceed to the designated safe area, where food and medical attention would be provided. The sergeant meant every word. I could see it in the footage. The assurance was not propaganda or tactical deception. It was genuine. That was what terrified me beyond anything else. Not the devastating scope of the orbital strikes, not the impossible coordination across dozens of star systems, not the stealth technology or the intelligence penetration or the 47 days of silent preparation. What reached into the deepest part of my professional understanding and shattered it was the control. The absolute, unwavering, seemingly limitless control that the humans maintained throughout every phase of the operation. The Drekari had murdered 8,400 humans, including 600 children. They had destroyed a medical station dedicated to healing and research. They had broadcast footage of the destruction as a trophy. And the humans had responded not with blind vengeance, not with indiscriminate retaliation, not with the overwhelming fury that every psychological model in the Bureau's archives predicted. They had responded with a military operation so precisely controlled, so meticulously calibrated to its stated objective, and so surgically executed that it looked less like warfare and more like a complex engineering procedure performed on a planetary scale. They had felt the rage. I am absolutely certain of that. I later obtained intercepted fragments of internal human communications from the period of silence, and the emotional content was staggering. The humans were grieving with an intensity that their language struggled to contain. They were angry at a depth that produced communications raw enough to make experienced intelligence analysts uncomfortable reading them. They felt every death on Meridian Point as a personal wound, but they did not allow the wound to drive their response. They harnessed it. They took the grief and the fury and the burning, desperate need for justice, and they converted all of it into 47 days of meticulous intelligence collection, operational planning, weapons deployment, and logistical preparation. They channeled the worst thing anyone had ever done to them into fuel for the most precisely executed military operation in the recorded history of galactic civilization. And then they did something that no species in the Bureau's 900-year archive of conflict documentation had ever done following a military victory of comparable magnitude. They put the Drekari military leadership on trial. Every admiral, every general, every intelligence director, every member of the military command council that had conceived, planned, authorized, and executed the attack on Meridian Point. The humans captured them alive, transported them under guard to a neutral facility in Concord-administered space, and assembled a legal prosecution team. They did not convene a military tribunal behind closed doors. They built a criminal case. They gathered evidence with the painstaking thoroughness of forensic investigators reconstructing a crime scene. They documented the chain of command from the Imperator's initial strategic authorization through every level of military planning to the strike commander's final execution orders. They collected forensic data from the wreckage of Meridian Point itself. They compiled communication intercepts, surveillance records, operational planning documents, and sworn testimony from Drekari military personnel who had participated in various stages of the operation. The trial was broadcast across the entire Concord. I watched every session from beginning to end. The lead human prosecutor was a woman named Nora Fleming. She was physically small, soft-spoken, and possessed a precision of language and presentation that I found both impressive and deeply unsettling. She never raised her voice. She never made emotional appeals to the tribunal or the watching galaxy. She presented evidence with the methodical calm of a research scientist, delivering findings at an academic conference. She walked the tribunal through the decision-making process that led to the attack on Meridian Point, step by documented step, identified every individual who contributed to that decision at every level of authority, and demonstrated their personal culpability with documentation so comprehensive and so meticulously verified that the defense counsel found themselves with almost nothing to contest that had not already been anticipated and addressed. I watched the Drekari commanders during the trial proceedings. They had expected summary execution. They had psychologically prepared themselves for death, which was the standard consequence for defeated military leaders in Drekari cultural tradition. What they received instead was something that visibly disturbed them far more than death would have. They received accountability. They received a meticulous, public, undeniable, and permanent accounting of exactly what they had done, who they had killed, and why their actions constituted crimes under established galactic law. The evidence was presented in front of the entire galaxy with a thoroughness that made denial impossible and excuses irrelevant. Nora Fleming did not need to raise her voice, because the evidence spoke with a volume that no amount of shouting could have matched. The tribunal convicted every defendant. The sentences were severe, but deliberately non-lethal. Extended imprisonment, permanent disqualification from military service or governmental authority, and public registration as convicted war criminals in the Concord's permanent records. The humans chose not to execute them. They let them live, in full view of a galaxy that now knew every detail of what they had done, carrying the weight of that knowledge for the rest of their natural lives. I sat in my office after the final verdict was delivered. The displays were dark, the building was silent. Everyone else had gone home hours earlier. And sitting there in the darkness, I understood at last, with a clarity that felt like ice crystallizing in my chest, what humanity truly was. They were not uncontrollable. They were the precise opposite of uncontrollable. They were the most controlled species I had ever encountered in 4 centuries of studying how civilizations wage war. They felt everything that any species feels when attacked: grief and rage and fury, and the desperate burning need for justice. And they did not permit any of it to dictate their response. They chose their response. They designed it. They refined it. They executed it with a discipline that made the galaxy's most professional military forces look crude by comparison. That was the real threat. Not that humans were dangerous when they lost control. Every species was dangerous when it lost control. Humans were dangerous precisely because they never lost control. They decided what proportional looked like, and then they built it. And then they delivered it with surgical precision. And then they followed it with a legal framework and a public trial, so the entire galaxy could see that even their fury operated within boundaries they had chosen and enforced upon themselves. I wrote my 3rd memo. It was 18 pages. I attached 300 hours of combat and trial footage, 14 separate tactical analyses prepared by bureau specialists, 6 independent psychological assessment models, and a comprehensive behavioral projection that I had been constructing and refining for over a year. I titled it, Resolution Request, Immediate Reclassification of Human Military Capability, Existential Threat Category. I sent it to every sitting member of the Galactic Concord Security Council, every single one. This time, they all read it, and 48 hours later, I received a formal summons to appear before the full assembly of the Galactic Concord. The assembly chamber of the Galactic Concord is the largest enclosed space ever constructed by cooperative interstellar effort. It occupies the central core of Concord Station, a massive structure orbiting a dead star in diplomatically neutral space, and it is engineered to simultaneously accommodate representatives from every member species. 1,247 delegations, each with their own atmospheric composition requirements, gravitational preferences, temperature ranges, communication protocols, and seating configurations. The chamber is a cathedral of governance, designed with painstaking care to make every species feel equally present, equally significant, and equally heard. I had entered the chamber before, during my career. Junior arbiters attend assembly sessions as part of their professional training. Senior arbiters occasionally present findings on conflicts of particular significance. But I had never stood at the central speaker's podium, the focal point of 1,200 attentive delegations. I had never experienced the specific quality of silence that descends over that enormous space, when every being in it understands that something is about to be said that cannot be unsaid, that the words about to be spoken will reshape the political landscape in ways that cannot be fully predicted. I stood at the podium with my presentation materials organized on the display surface before me, and my hands resting steadily at my sides. My hands were steady, my hearts were not. I possessed 2 of them, a standard feature of my species' cardiovascular system, and both were operating at a rate that my personal physician would have strongly recommended I address. The Speaker of the Assembly called the session to order and introduced the agenda item, Resolution 1187, proposed by the War Conduct Bureau, through Senior Arbiter Thalvek Sorn. Subject: formal reclassification of human military capability and proposed permanent restrictions on human participation in armed conflict under Concord jurisdiction. The chamber was already vibrating with urgent conversation before the speaker finished the introduction. Rumors had been circulating through diplomatic channels for days. Everyone in the chamber already knew, in broad terms, what I was going to propose. Not everyone agreed that it should be proposed. I began with the Vethrani border skirmish, the first case. I presented the tactical overview, the force ratios, the expected outcome, and the actual result. I showed selected combat footage. I highlighted the adaptation patterns, the environmental exploitation, the systematic refusal to surrender under conditions that every military doctrine in the galaxy defined as hopeless. I watched delegates lean forward with interest. I watched others gesture dismissively, signaling to their colleagues that this was a minor anomaly, being inflated beyond its significance. A border skirmish against a second-rate power. An unexpected outcome, perhaps, but hardly grounds for unprecedented legislative action. I moved to the HFY War. The atmosphere in the chamber shifted perceptibly. The HFY were respected throughout the Concord. Their military was genuinely admired, and they had been beaten. Decisively, comprehensively, and humiliatingly beaten by a species that had started the war with a fraction of their military capability. I presented the mobilization data, the industrial conversion rates, the volunteer enrollment figures. I showed the weapons development timeline, 4 months from theoretical concept to deployed operational system, a pace that drew visible reactions from the military advisors in several major delegations. I showed Admiral Kate Morrison's combat transmission. I played the audio recording in the original human language, with simultaneous translation overlay, for every species in the chamber. They burned Harvest Landing, 12,000 civilians. 4,100 of them were children. We are not regrouping. We are going through them. All units, attack speed. The chamber was quiet after that recording, not the restless quiet of whispered consultations and shuffled notes. The heavy, weighted quiet of intelligent beings confronting an uncomfortable truth they would have preferred to avoid. I presented the Drakari case last, as I had planned. I walked the assembly through every phase: the attack on Meridian Point, the 47 days of absolute silence, the simultaneous precision strike on every Drakari military asset, the ground campaign, and the trial. I showed the coordination. I showed the control. I showed the civilian casualty figures from the ground operation, essentially 0. I let that number remain on the display in the silence of the chamber for a long time, because it was the number that mattered most. It was the number that proved these were not berserkers. These were engineers of warfare so skilled and so disciplined that they could dismantle a civilization's military capacity across multiple worlds while leaving the civilian population almost entirely unharmed. Then I presented the projections. The data I had spent over a year compiling, modeling, testing, and refining, until I was certain of its validity. I had tracked human military development rates across every available metric: technological advancement speed, industrial production capacity, population growth, weapons innovation timelines, demonstrated adaptation speed under combat conditions, and the psychological resilience factors that allowed them to sustain military operations under conditions that would have broken any other species. I had integrated all of these variables into the Bureau's most sophisticated predictive frameworks, the same models we use to forecast the probable outcomes of hypothetical conflicts between any combination of Concord member species. The results appeared on the main display behind me, rendered in simple visual formats that every species in the chamber could immediately comprehend. I did not need to explain what the curves showed. They spoke for themselves, with the eloquence of mathematics that does not argue or persuade, but simply states what is. At their current rate of military development, within 200 standard years, no single species in the Galactic Concord would possess the capability to prevail in a sustained military conflict against humanity. Within 300 years, no plausible coalition of species would possess that capability either. I allowed the projections to remain on the display, while the implications settled over the chamber, like sediment through deep water. Then I spoke the words I had been preparing and rehearsing for months. The question before this assembly is not whether humans can be defeated today. Today, With sufficient coalition force and coordinated effort, they probably can be. The question is, what happens when they cannot be defeated at all? And based on every piece of data I have collected and analyzed over the past 3 years, that day is approaching. It is not a speculative possibility. It is a mathematical certainty. The only variable is timing. The chamber erupted into the closest thing to chaos that the structured environment of the assembly permits. Delegations were shouting over each other. Military advisors were pulling up their own projection models on portable displays. Diplomatic attaches were conferring in urgent clusters. The speaker called for order 3 times before the noise subsided to a level that permitted structured debate. The opposition was immediate, vocal, and substantive. The Rithani ambassador, a distinguished career diplomat named Seveth Cole, secured the floor and delivered an address that I must acknowledge was both eloquent and morally compelling. No species, he argued, had ever been banned from warfare in the 900-year history of the Concord. The principle of sovereign military right was foundational to the Concord's charter, woven into the basic architecture of interstellar law. What I was proposing was not regulation or oversight. It was punishment. And the species I proposed to punish had not started a single one of the conflicts I had described. They had been attacked, every time without exception, and they had defended themselves. Effectively, yes. Devastatingly, certainly. But they had defended themselves. What I was asking the assembly to do was punish a species for being too effective at self-defense. He called it cowardice, dressed in the language of policy. Several delegations applauded with visible enthusiasm. The Kelvari delegation, to the surprise of many observers, spoke in partial support of the resolution. Their ambassador, choosing her words with care and speaking without the bitterness or resentment that many had expected, acknowledged that the Kelvari had underestimated humanity and had paid an extraordinarily steep price for that underestimation. She did not argue for the ban out of wounded pride or desire for revenge. She argued for it on the grounds of what she termed strategic realism. Humans were not like other species, she said with quiet conviction. The normal principles and patterns of military competition did not apply to them, and a galaxy that continued to pretend otherwise was a galaxy walking toward a catastrophe from which recovery might not be possible. The debate continued for hours. 6 more delegations spoke against the resolution. 4 spoke in favor. The arguments on both sides were principled, well-reasoned, and genuinely difficult to dismiss. Sovereignty against collective security. Individual species rights against existential risk to the galactic community. The weight of precedent against the demands of prudence. I listened to every speaker and felt the moral gravity of every argument pressing against my professional judgment. Then the human delegation requested the speaking floor. The chamber went silent with a speed that I found deeply revealing. 1,247 species, many of which had been engaged in heated debate moments earlier, fell instantly quiet the moment the human ambassador rose from her delegation's seats. They were afraid. I could see it in their postures, their stillness, the way their attention locked onto the human representative with an intensity that went beyond diplomatic courtesy. They were afraid, not of what she might say, but of what she represented. Of the species sitting calmly in their assigned section of the chamber, watching this debate about their future with expressions that revealed nothing. The human ambassador was a woman named Helen Carter. She was tall, composed, and she walked to the speaker's podium with the unhurried confidence of someone who had decided exactly what she was going to say and exactly how long she was going to take saying it. She did not say much. She acknowledged my findings. She did not dispute the data or challenge the projections. She did not argue that I was mistaken about human military capabilities. She said, clearly and without embellishment, that humanity had never initiated a war, not against the Vethrani, not against the Kelvari, not against the Drakari. Every conflict I had described had been started by another species, and humanity had responded. In every case, without exception, humanity had been the defender. Arbiter Sorn proposes to ban the victim, she said. I would ask this assembly to consider whether that punishes the aggressor or emboldens them. She paused. She looked out across the chamber, her gaze moving slowly across the assembled delegations, with an expression I could not fully interpret, despite my extensive experience reading alien and human facial signals. Then she said, "Humanity will honor whatever this assembly decides. We joined the Concord in good faith, and we will respect its decisions in good faith. But I want every species in this chamber to understand what is being proposed today. You are not banning a weapon, you are banning a people, and you are banning them not for what they have done wrong, but for what they do too well." She returned to her delegation's seats and sat down. The silence that followed lasted longer than any silence I had experienced in that chamber. I did not sleep that night. I sat in my quarters on Concord Station, staring through the viewport at the dead star that served as the station's gravitational anchor, and I wrestled with Helen Carter's words. She was right. Humanity had not started any of these wars. Every drop of blood that had been spilled, every ship that had been destroyed, every settlement that had been burned, every child who had died on Meridian Point, was the direct consequence of another species deciding to attack humans. I was proposing to punish the species that had been victimized for the quality of its self-defense. The moral logic of that position was, by any honest assessment, deeply problematic. But the mathematics was equally inescapable. I pulled up my projections on the viewport display and stared at the curves again, as I had stared at them dozens of times. 2 centuries, 3 at the absolute outside, and then no force in the galaxy, no coalition however large, would be able to stop them. Not if they were provoked. Not if some future aggressor, some species that had not yet learned the lessons the Vethrani and Kelvari and Drakari had learned at such devastating cost, decided to strike first, and triggered a response that humanity decided should be final and comprehensive. That was the fear that lived at the center of everything I was doing, not what humans had done when attacked. I had documented what they did when attacked, and it was devastating but proportional, measured, controlled. My fear was about a line that I could see in the projections but could not precisely locate. The threshold. The breaking point. The moment at which humanity looked at the galaxy that kept attacking them and decided that proportional response was no longer sufficient. The moment at which they concluded that the only way to ensure permanent safety was to ensure that nothing in the galaxy retained the capability to threaten them ever again. I had seen the extraordinary control they exercised, and I admired it. But control is not the same as permanent restraint. What happens when the most militarily capable civilization in galactic history exhausts its patience? Resolution 1187 was put to a vote the following day. It passed with 63% of delegations voting in favor. Humans were formally and permanently banned from participating in any armed conflict under Concord jurisdiction. If attacked, humanity could petition the Concord for collective defensive response. They could not wage war independently. They could not maintain offensive military forces. They could not develop weapons systems beyond a narrowly defined defensive threshold. The human delegation received the result without visible reaction. Helen Carter stood, collected her materials, and led her people out of the chamber in orderly silence. No protest, no angry words. No dramatic final statement for the historical record. They walked out as calmly as they had sat through the debate, and the chamber doors closed behind them. I was standing near the corridor exit when the delegation passed. Helen Carter walked within arm's reach of where I stood. She did not stop. She did not speak to me. But she looked at me as she passed, briefly, and the expression on her face was something I have thought about nearly every day since that moment. It was not defeat. It was not bitterness or resignation. It was not the expression of someone who had lost something important. It was the expression of someone who was noting a new variable in an ongoing calculation, filing it away, adding it to a framework that was already running in her mind and had been running long before the vote was called. I stood in that corridor long after the humans had gone. Behind me, the celebration was beginning in the chamber. Delegations congratulating each other, speeches about collective security and galactic stability, and the wisdom of proactive governance. The sound of 1,200 species telling themselves that they had identified a problem and solved it through the democratic institutions they had built. I did not feel like celebrating. I went back to my quarters. I sat down. I pulled up my projection models one final time and stared at the curves. They showed military capability over time. That was what I had built them to measure and forecast. I had not built them to model what happens when you take the most adaptable, most innovative, most relentlessly capable species in galactic history and tell them they cannot use the one tool they have proven most proficient with. I should have built that model. I would understand that failure much later, and the understanding would bring no comfort. I should have asked not what happens when humans fight, but what happens when humans are forced to find a different way to be powerful. I retired from the War Conduct Bureau 11 years after Resolution 187 passed. I had served for over 4 centuries, and I told the Bureau's leadership and my colleagues that the retirement was overdue, that I had earned the right to step back, that talented younger arbiters were more than capable of carrying the Bureau's work forward. All of that was true. None of it was the real reason I left. The real reason was that I had begun to see something in the data that frightened me more profoundly than anything in my long career, and I did not want to be the one holding the file when the rest of the galaxy finally recognized what I was seeing. The humans complied with Resolution 1187 completely, immediately, and without any form of resistance or delay. They decommissioned their offensive fleet according to the prescribed timeline. They dismantled weapons platforms, shuttered military research facilities, and deactivated shipyard construction bays. They reduced their armed forces to a small defensive garrison well within the strict limits specified by the resolution. They did everything the Concord required, on schedule, with full documentary transparency, and open access to Concord inspection teams, who were given unrestricted access to every facility, every database, and every record they requested. The galaxy exhaled. I watched the collective relief spread through the Concord's member species, like warmth through a cold room. Delegations that had spent years anxiously monitoring reports of human military developments suddenly found their monitoring stations quiet and their intelligence analysts reassigned to other tasks. 3 species that had been avoiding expansion into border regions near human space, quietly terrified of provoking the attention of a military power they could not match, began colonizing those regions with open enthusiasm. The Concord congratulated itself on what was widely described as a historic achievement in collective governance. The most dangerous military force in the galaxy had been peacefully contained through democratic process, and it had not cost a single shot fired. I did not share the relief. I sat in my bureau office, and I watched the humans comply with every provision, every clause, every subclause of Resolution 1187. And I felt the same specific quality of dread I had experienced during the 47 days of silence following the destruction of Meridian Point, because I recognized the pattern. The silence before the Drakari operation was not paralysis or indecision. It was preparation. And the seamless compliance following Resolution 1187 was not submission or acceptance of defeat. It was adaptation. The humans were not giving up. They were pivoting. And the speed and completeness of the pivot told me that they had anticipated this outcome, or something very like it, and had already developed contingency plans for what to do next. Within 5 years of the ban, human medical research institutions produced breakthroughs in cellular regeneration therapy, neural pathway reconstruction, and cross-species pharmacological engineering that the Concord's most advanced biomedical civilizations could not replicate or even fully understand. Human medical teams began offering their services and expertise to species across the galaxy, treating conditions that had been considered permanent and untreatable for centuries, developing therapeutic protocols customized to alien physiologies that no other species had previously studied. They did not charge exploitative rates. They built collaborative partnerships. They trained alien medical students. They established research facilities on alien worlds and invited local scientists to participate as equal partners. Within 10 years, human engineering corporations had fundamentally transformed energy production, atmospheric processing, and habitat construction technologies across nearly 50 species territories. They designed power generation systems that were cleaner, more efficient, more reliable, and less expensive to maintain than anything the galaxy had previously seen. They developed terraforming methodologies that could render hostile worlds habitable in years, rather than the centuries that conventional approaches required. They constructed infrastructure with such elegant engineering that the species benefiting from it could not imagine returning to the systems they had used before. Within 20 years, human corporations held exclusive or primary patents on technologies that entire civilizations depended on for the basic functions of daily existence. Human engineers maintained power distribution networks on worlds whose own technical personnel no longer possessed the expertise to service the systems they relied upon. Human communication network architecture carried the majority of interstellar data traffic across hundreds of star systems. Human financial institutions managed investment portfolios and economic development programs for species that had entrusted their economic futures to human expertise. Human agricultural technology and food production systems fed populations on worlds that had never been able to feed themselves before human agronomists arrived. I tracked this from retirement with the same methodical attention I had once dedicated to combat footage analysis. I maintained my Bureau data access credentials, and I monitored the economic, technological, and political data streams with the fading eyesight, but undiminished analytical rigor of a retired professional who could not stop analyzing patterns. I built tracking models and trend projections and dependency matrices, and every single one of them told the same story in different statistical languages. The galaxy was becoming dependent on humanity, not gradually, not subtly, not through any process that could be mistaken for natural economic integration, rapidly, comprehensively, and irreversibly. The same species that had been banned from building warships was becoming the indispensable foundation of galactic civilization, and they were accomplishing this not through coercion, manipulation, or economic exploitation, but through simple excellence. They were better at building things, better at solving complex problems, better at creating practical value from theoretical knowledge than any other species in the Concord. The same extraordinary adaptability that had made them terrifying on battlefields was making them indispensable in laboratories, engineering bays, hospitals, and trading floors. I received a visit, 7 years into my retirement, from a young bureau analyst named Sorel Tay. She had been assigned to compile a routine economic impact assessment of human commercial activity for the Bureau's annual strategic review. What she found in the data was not routine. She brought her findings to me because, she explained with the nervous directness of a junior professional approaching a legendary retired superior, I was the only person she trusted to understand the full implications of what she had discovered. She presented her analysis on a portable display, sitting across from me in my garden, while the evening light dimmed around us, and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. If humanity withdrew its technological contributions from the galactic economy, she told me, if they simply stopped licensing their patents, recalled their engineering teams, closed their research partnerships, and shut down their trade networks, 47 species would face immediate critical infrastructure failure. Their power generation systems would cease functioning, their communication networks would collapse. Their medical facilities would lose access to treatments and technologies that millions of patients depended on for survival. She paused and looked at me to make sure I understood the scale of what she was describing before continuing. Within a standard year of such a withdrawal, she said, another 112 species would enter severe economic depression. Interstellar supply chains would fragment. Industrial production capacity would plummet as manufacturing systems built around human-designed components and processes ceased to function. Financial markets would destabilize as investment systems managed by human institutions lost their operational foundation. I studied her numbers. I verified her methodology. I checked her assumptions and her data sources. Everything was sound. The projections were, if anything, conservative. They do not need weapons, I said quietly. Sorel Tay met my eyes and nodded. She was young, but she understood the weight of what she was carrying. They have made themselves into something more valuable than any fleet, she said. They have made themselves necessary. I sat alone in my garden for a long time after she left, watching the stars multiply in the deepening darkness overhead. I thought about Helen Carter walking past me in the corridor of Concord Station with that expression on her face. Not defeated, not bitter. Thoughtful, calculating. She had already known, I realized. Standing there in that corridor, walking away from the vote that had stripped her species of its military rights, she had already been computing the trajectory of what came next. Not how to fight the ban, not how to overturn it or circumvent it or resist it, how to make it irrelevant. The definitive confirmation of everything I feared arrived 7 years after Sorel Tay's visit, during what the diplomatic archives now refer to as the Morthak incident. The Morthak coalition was a minor regional power, aggressive by temperament, and poorly governed by leaders who compensated for strategic weakness with tactical belligerence. They possessed a military force just large enough to create serious problems for their immediate neighbors, and leadership just reckless enough to deploy it without adequate consideration of consequences. They attacked a human colony settlement on the outer edge of Morthak-claimed space, deploying 3 warships and a ground assault force, accompanied by a declaration of territorial sovereignty that would have been diplomatically laughable if people had not died because of it. Under the terms of Resolution 1187, the humans were unable to defend themselves. They possessed no offensive fleet, no heavy weapons systems, and no military response capability beyond the limited defensive garrison permitted by the resolution. They were legally required to submit a formal petition to the Concord requesting collective defensive intervention, and then to wait for the Concord's member species to assemble, coordinate, and deploy a coalition response force on their behalf. The Concord mobilized a response. It took 9 days. 9 days to identify willing participant species, negotiate command structure, coordinate logistics, assemble the coalition fleet, and travel to the engagement zone. During those 9 days, the Morthak ground forces burned 2 human settlements. 412 humans died while waiting for the collective defense system that was supposed to protect them to arrive and start protecting them. The coalition response force eventually reached the affected system, engaged and drove off the Morthak military force, and restored security to the human colony. The Concord imposed formal diplomatic sanctions on the Morthak coalition. Condemnatory resolutions were passed. Stern language was deployed in official communications. The institutional machinery of interstellar governance processed the incident at its customary measured pace. The humans submitted a formal petition to the Concord, requesting authorization to maintain a limited defensive military force capable of responding to attacks on human territory without the delay inherent in the collective defense mobilization process. The petition was carefully worded, legally precise, and logically unassailable. 412 people had died because the system designed to protect disarmed humanity was structurally too slow to protect them in practice. The Concord debated the petition. The debate was extensive, technically complex, and ultimately inconclusive. Multiple species argued that any degree of human remilitarization, even purely defensive in scope, risked undermining the fundamental purpose and credibility of Resolution 1187. Others argued, with equal conviction, that the resolution was meaningless and morally bankrupt if it could not actually protect the species it had forcibly disarmed. The debate continued for months without resolution. While the Concord deliberated, the galaxy rendered its own verdict through mechanisms that no resolution could regulate or control. Within 2 weeks of the Morthak attack, 4 species quietly terminated their commercial contracts with Morthak-affiliated trading companies. Within a month, 7 additional species followed. Human corporations and institutions did not issue threats, ultimatums, or public statements. They did not need to. Their commercial partners across the galaxy independently performed a very simple economic calculation. The Morthak had attacked the species that kept their power grids running, their medical systems functioning, their communication networks operational, and their economies growing. Maintaining business relationships with entities associated with the Morthak coalition meant risking the far more valuable relationship with humanity. Within 6 months, the Morthak coalition was comprehensively economically isolated. Their trade revenues had collapsed. Their access to advanced technology had evaporated as suppliers refused to fill orders. Their diplomatic allies had publicly distanced themselves. Their economy was contracting at a rate that threatened fundamental social stability. Within a standard year, the Morthak government collapsed. Not through military action, not through Concord intervention, not through sanctions or blockades or any instrument of institutional authority, through economic pressure so comprehensive, so organic, and so distributed across hundreds of independent actors that it appeared less like a coordinated campaign and more like a natural gravitational consequence. The Morthak had attacked the species upon which galactic civilization had come to depend, and the galaxy had responded, independently and without coordination, by cutting them off from everything that civilization provided. I investigated the matter thoroughly, using every analytical resource and intelligence contact available to me. I found no evidence of orchestrated economic warfare by the human government, no secret directives, no behind-the-scenes pressure on trading partners, no coordinated diplomatic campaign. The galaxy had simply done its own mathematics, independently and simultaneously, and reached the obvious conclusion. You do not attack the foundation your house is built on. The Morthak's successor government paid full reparations to the affected human colony. They paid not because the Concord ordered them to, but because it was the only path to ending their economic exile and reconnecting with the interstellar systems they needed to survive as a functioning civilization. The humans accepted the reparations, rebuilt their settlements, and resumed normal commercial operations with the same calm efficiency they brought to everything else. I sat in my garden on the evening I finished reading the final intelligence summary of the Morthak affair, and I understood at last the full architecture of what had happened. I understood, with the comprehensive clarity that only comes when the last piece of a very large puzzle settles into its place, what Resolution 1187 had actually accomplished. I had designed the resolution to neutralize humanity's most dangerous capability. I had studied their military power, their terrifying adaptability, their psychological refusal to accept defeat, their capacity for controlled and precisely calibrated fury, and I had concluded that the galaxy could not safely coexist with a species that waged war the way humans did. So I had taken away their ability to fight. I had removed their fleets, their weapons, their military infrastructure, their capacity to wage the kind of war that my projections showed would eventually become unstoppable. I had congratulated myself, and the galaxy had congratulated itself, on containing the threat through enlightened collective governance. And the humans had responded by becoming something that no fleet could match. They had become the infrastructure that powered civilizations, the medicine that healed alien children, the technology that connected worlds, the engineering expertise that kept cities functioning, the economic engine that generated prosperity, the agricultural science that fed populations that had never known food security. They had woven themselves so deeply, so thoroughly, and so indispensably into the fundamental fabric of galactic civilization that threatening them was no longer a military calculation. It was an existential one, not for the humans, for the attacker, for anyone foolish enough to harm the species that the galaxy could no longer function without. I had tried to remove humanity from the equation of galactic power. Instead, I had forced them to become the equation itself. I am old now. My centuries of service to the Bureau are far behind me. I spend my remaining years in my garden, reading the intelligence summaries that Sorel Tay, now a senior analyst herself, still sends me as a professional courtesy. I watch the data streams with aging eyes and an analytical mind that has not yet learned how to stop working. I am often asked whether I regret authoring Resolution 1187. The question comes from journalists and historians and students, and the occasional visiting diplomat, all seeking a definitive answer from a figure their histories describe as consequential. They want clarity. They want a clean narrative. Yes or no. Regret or vindication. The answer is neither clean nor simple, and it is both things at once. The ban worked. By every metric I originally used to justify it, Resolution 1187 has been a comprehensive success. Humans have not fought a war in decades. The galaxy is more stable, more peaceful, and more prosperous than it has been in living memory for any species in the Concord. No civilization dares to attack humanity because the economic and technological consequences would be immediately catastrophic, and the Concord's collective defense obligation provides a military deterrent for the rare actor, too foolish to understand economic consequences. But I look at the galaxy now, and I see something that no resolution can regulate, no vote can contain, and no ban can prevent. I see the economies that run on human patents. I see the power grids maintained by human engineers who understand systems that their hosts no longer comprehend. I see the medical centers where human researchers develop treatments that save alien lives by the millions. I see the communication networks that carry human-designed data across 1,000 star systems. I see the political alliances that function because human cooperation makes them profitable. I see the financial systems that grow wealth because human institutions manage them with the same relentless competence that humans bring to everything they touch. I see a species that was told it could not use its greatest strength and responded by discovering a greater one. A species that was stripped of its weapons and made weapons unnecessary. The most adaptable, most innovative, most stubbornly and brilliantly capable civilization in the history of this galaxy, operating without a single warship, wielding more real power than any fleet ever constructed. I wanted to take away their most dangerous weapon. I succeeded. But I failed to understand that war was never their most dangerous weapon. War was simply the version of human capability that we could observe and measure and fear in terms our military models understood. When we took it away, they revealed the version that cannot be measured by tonnage or firepower, the version that does not come with warships and battle formations, and things that can be counted and regulated and banned. They revealed the version that looks like a medical breakthrough saving your children from a disease you thought was incurable, and an engineer maintaining the power system your city cannot survive without, and a trade network delivering the goods your people need to eat, and a financial system growing the wealth your civilization depends on. They revealed that the most dangerous thing about humanity was never its capacity for violence. It was its capacity for everything else. I close my files. I set my notes aside. The garden is quiet around me, and the stars are bright above, and somewhere out there, on 1,000 worlds scattered across a galaxy that once feared them enough to disarm them, human engineers are keeping the systems running that civilizations depend on for survival. Human researchers are developing the medicines that cure diseases alien doctors cannot treat. Human teachers are training the next generation of alien scientists and engineers. Human traders are moving the goods that feed families on worlds they have never visited. They are everywhere. They are everything. They are woven so deeply into the functioning of galactic civilization that removing them is no longer a conceivable option. And they are the most peaceful, most constructive, most generous force this galaxy has ever known. We told them they could not fight. So they made sure they would never have to.